This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
We're going to pretend that we are the editors of a journal called the most prestigious journal in the world. That's the title of our journal. And we want to accept this poem, but we want to make it perfect for the most prestigious journal in the world. I think looking at it not as something that you've got to throw away, but as something that you can improve is a big difference. We're not going to say this poem sucks, even if it does. I mean, what we're going to do is, what can we do to make this poem better? And it's a lot easier, I think, to take it if somebody says, okay, here's how I think you can make this good poem into an awesome poem.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Rick Magee, Bethel's Poet Laureate and an English professor at Sacred Heart University. Rick grew up in California and moved to the East Coast to work on his PhD. His wife, Rebecca, is also an English professor, and their son, Cormac, wants to be a writer when he grows up. Rick is published in a variety of online journals and is still waiting to hear from publishers about his poetry chapbook. Thanks for joining me this morning, Rick. I'm so glad to share this time with you and to talk about your poetry life.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been excited about this all week and really looking forward to it. And I'm going to kind of half give good news. I heard yesterday that a place wants to publish. I don't want to give more information yet because I haven't got the contract and all that, but my chapbook has been picked up. So I'm ecstatic about that.
Well, congratulations. Can you share the title yet? Or
yeah, it's called Green Latitudes.
Nice.
Yeah. And, you know, as we were chatting before we started here, that so many of my poems are rooted in place. Each of the poems, well, all but one actually, of the poems in the book, I put the geographical coordinates for each inspiration place. So I think that'd be kind of fun.
You know what? I think that's fascinating. And as a writer and as somebody who's deeply rooted in Connecticut, I feel like place is very, very important. So since that's such an important feature in your book, can we talk a little bit about place and how that figures into your writing?
Is there some specific direction you'd like me to go with this, or just let me ramble for a bit?
No. Let's hear from your perspective. I mean, for me, place is really about physical place, and it is very relevant to notice where you are. And I think just for me in our internet age and this idea of place not mattering, like people don't really seem to have mailing addresses anymore. They have web addresses and email addresses, and yet where we are does matter. And I have to say, I'm a place snob. I'm a little skeptical of people who disregard place as being an important thing. And I'm always really excited by writers who think it matters. So go ahead, play to my prejudices. What do you think?
No. I love your prejudices. I'm going to go back to the beginning. And I think that a lot of it comes from the place where I was born. I was born in a town called Taft, which is in the San Joaquin Valley in California. And it's not a great place. I mean, it's in the desert, desertish area. It's an oil town. These days when you go there, you can actually smell the hydrogen sulfide, pumped out from the oils. And my dad and I were both born in the same hospital, which was weird at the time to be a second generation native Californian. It was kind of an unusual thing. It's not so unusual now. But my dad really grew to kind of despise the place that we lived because it was dry and dusty and hot. And he was always wanting a greener place. And I think that kind of explains my obsession with Ireland. And he suffered very badly from PTSD from coming back from Vietnam. And as a result, he couldn't keep a job, and we moved around a lot. And I think for him, moving to a different place was a way of kind of running away from himself. And he was kind of hoping to find who he was at each new place. And because of that, I think place has always been a really anxious thing for me. And I've kind of inherited his distrust, problems with dry places. And That's also why the green latitudes is in the title of my poem, of my poetry book. Whenever we get a rainstorm in Taft, he would turn into a new person, like, oh yes, it's life. And then it would get dry again, and he would get depressed and angry, and the dry dust. And I respect and read a lot of writers who kind of worship the desert, and I kind of get it, but it also kind of makes me feel really uncomfortable. So for me, place is, I think, more of a quest, because I didn't live in any one place, and I'm 2,800 miles from where I was born right now, and I've been living here now for almost 28 years, so basically half my life. So yeah, trying to find roots is important to me, and trying to think of what kind of soil my poetry grows in is really, really vital.
I think it's really a powerful thing, the way place can affect.
Oh, infect works too, though. Actually, it really does.
Language and word choices and that satisfaction. Last week when we had this threatening cold snap, was it going to take our green away from us?
Right.
I was like Teletubbyville in my garden. I had buckets on everything to try to make sure that the cold air didn't take it away. And I couldn't wait to get outside and check the rhododendron and see if we still had our flowers, But that sense of renewal, and then that's very much about a physical experience of place and life. Let's jump into that Ireland thing. What brought you there, and why does that speak to you as a writer and a thinker?
Well, I started going there, and most of the times I go because Sacred Heart has a campus in Dingle out in West Kerry, and it's an amazingly beautiful place. It's part of the Gaeltacht region, and way, way out there. And the first couple of classes I taught were more literature based. We were reading Old Irish, some of the old poetry, bits of the Tyne, things like that. The last 3 times I've gone, I've been teaching a poetry writing class, and the last one I finally kind of solidified figured out what the class was going to be about. And to kind of go the backwards way around it, before that class, I was teaching a class here in Connecticut, a creative writing class, and my students kept remarking how they noticed that they and their peers were all kind of going into trauma to write about, to kind of write through their trauma. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that this is something that seems really important to them. And I was teaching a literature class, and we were reading Yeats and his Easter 1916 poem. We were just talking about that, and he uses the phrase "a terrible beauty is born," and that's just an amazing line, just such a fabulous line. And I thought, Ireland has this kind of weird landscape that you've got this incredibly lush green. You walk through, and you know what I'm talking about here. You walk through, you see the green, you just want to lie down in the grass, right? Because it looks so lush. But then there are these fierce rocks and the kind of harsh weather. So there's this kind of weird pull in 2 different directions between the sublime and the beautiful, and the comforting and the threatening. And it kind of seems to me that there's this stereotype of the Irish persona or personality that's kind of melancholy in some ways, but also kind of joyous in some ways too. And I thought that Yeats' phrase "a terrible beauty" kind of sums that up, the terror and the beauty both. So I thought for this writing class in Ireland, we will look at a lot of poems that are talking about the landscape and using that as a metaphor for somebody's own feeling. And then we'll write our own poetry about who we are, the trauma that we face, and use the landscape as a place to either think about that, or to think about healing, or anything like that. So I think I keep coming back to this because this class I taught in January, and January also marked 30 years that I've been teaching. So I started teaching as a grad student. The best class I've ever taught. I mean, far and away. And I've had some really good classes, but this class in Ireland was amazing. The writing that came out of it, the bonding of the students, just the whole experience. So we traveled, did a lot of field trips. Every day we did some sort of a field trip. We would sometimes just walk around Dingle Harbor and, get up to a spot where we kind of look out at the ocean and, the sun peeking through the clouds and, kind of think about who we were. We went to my favorite spot in the entire world, which is a place called Peddler's Lake near Connor Pass, and walked up this kind of difficult rocky path to this utterly beautiful lake. And one of the students, a young woman, got really terrified on the way down and had trouble getting down, and we all kind of helped her get down. And that moment of the terror of the landscape, but then she sort of felt like she'd accomplished something after. So there was this terror layered with feeling of joy, which kind of perfectly encapsulated the theme of the class for a lot of us. And then we went to a place called Tobernac Gelt, the Well of the Madman, which has been one of those holy wells where people have gone for centuries. Supposedly, when you drink the water, it can help cure madness. And interestingly enough, in 2012, RTE4 did a documentary there, and they decided to test the well water and found out it had high concentrations of lithium. So,
right.
And I just love things like that. I love it when old folk tales kind of, are somehow validated by science in some ways. So I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but I think that, we read parts of some poems from The Poison Glen by Anne-Marie Nichurin, and she uses this glen up in Donegal that it may mean the Poison Glen, or it may not. There may be a translation error there, but she does a lot of writing about the mother and infant homes and the maudlin houses and things like that. And she kind of uses that glen as a metaphor for the trauma that people feel. So I think that's where Ireland kind of works in to my own vision. Like I said before, it was always, when I was growing up, kind of this kind of fairy tale lost home for us, because, with my dad being so anxious about where we were and anxious about, depressed about being in America, he was always kind of, talking about, oh, I wish we could go back to Ireland. Not that we'd ever been there. But so there's kind of this family myth for me, and then the actual reality of the landscape kind of working together.
It's really kind of fascinating, Ireland coming through its own sequences of traumas over the centuries,
Yes.
whether it was colonization, being stripped of their trees,
Right.
And coping with colonization and the shame of colonization, throwing that off, and then recognizing the trauma that the church inflicted. So
exactly,
all these forces these paternalistic forces that presented themselves as the fixer-uppers of a landscape that really offered its own answers. You talk about the Well of the Madman being rich in lithium. People didn't need problem solved. They didn't have problems. They had a life and a world. And I think the Irish landscape gives you back yourself in a way. And because it's so vast and so open, when you are walking that landscape, you're on your own, and you are with yourself. And it is unforgiving as it is beautiful. You can land on your head and it will hurt. Mother Earth is a neutral force in so many ways, but there's an honesty there, and
yes.
it's in Irish literature, that honesty. And I think the sort of post-colonial time for Ireland has allowed it to recover that honesty.
Yeah.
And a lot of contemporary poets do exactly that. So it's awesome that your students have been able to find that for themselves.
I was very pleasantly surprised by how deeply they felt it. And interestingly enough, Sacred Heart, being a Catholic university in the Northeast, we tend to get a lot of Irish American names. But this class, I was the only person with any Irish ancestry. All of the rest of them were mainly, Northeast Italian last names, right? But they, despite not having their own, Irish ancestry, they dove into it and really kind of felt, some sort of rootedness or healing or perspective. I think was a word that students used a lot. There was one time that we did this hike, and we started walking it, and I let them know, if you feel like you've had enough, you can turn around and go back. And people had enough and they turned around, and it ended up being me, Rebecca, our son Cormac, and then two students who managed, we got up to the top, and we got up to the top of this little hill, and there is the whole, Dingle Harbor, Ventry, everything's spread out behind us, and the sun is kind of coming through the clouds in this kind of liquid silvery gold, and it literally was breathtaking. The students kind of stopped and felt, and then they went back and they wrote about it, and that's what was really good for me, is every time we would go on one of these excursions, they would come back and feel like they'd been charged in some way to write. And just the harsh beauty of the landscape does flip some kind of a switch. I think it somehow allowed them to take chances with their writing that I don't think they felt comfortable with before. The harshness, they could see there was that harshness, the stones, the winds, the rain, and that allowed them to access that in themselves. And then I think they also, several times we were talking before about wanting to kind of roll in the grass, and my students were kind of saying the same thing. You'd see this lush green, you just kind of want to lie down there and for the whole day. And that kind of juxtaposition of the threat and the comfort allowed them access things in their own writing, I think. And I've definitely found that with my writing. One of my poems a few years back, when I was teaching, we usually try to do a little bit of a trip somewhere not in Dingle, and we went up into the north, and we'd stopped at Giant's Causeway. My son, who was I think 6 or 7 at the time, pointed to this kind of craggy, mountain sticking out into the water there by Giant's Causeway, and he goes, "I want to go there." I'm like, okay. So we went up there, and again, there's the thick, lush grass, but then it drops, 200 feet into the North Atlantic. So there's that, kind of terrifying danger and the comfort of the land at the same time. And that, I guess I keep coming back to that bouncing back and forth between comfort and terror. And I think that's where a lot of the strength of the Irish poets comes from, that bouncing back and forth between those extremes. I mean, you can see it in so many of them. Seamus Heaney, right? I mean, so many of his poems are rooted in that harsh landscape, but he finds comfort in it. So I'm just thinking, probably his most famous poem, Digging, where he has that, that literally grounded in the turf.
Yeah, and I think it's basic definition of home, right, is the risk taking and the comfort of the return that Heaney captures in a really amazing Irish way. And also Doreen Negrifa in her her beautiful novel A Ghost in the Throat, it is through this poetry that we figure out who we are, and we establish our story. And it sounds like the poetry class with your students really does build that sense of community and safety.
Yes.
I guess the English teacher in me is really curious. What was the methodology that you employed to help them write their poems? Were they writing to a specific form or in conversation with other poets? How did that look?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't do anything with form. I let them do whatever they wanted with form. The class was an interesting mix because I had one young woman who may be one of the strongest poets I've ever read, for somebody at that age. And then others who I've never written a poem before in my life. But by the end of the semester, they had. As far as the methodology, we would spend at least half of every class reading poets, or we didn't just read poets. Do you know Carrie Doherty's Thin Places? Mm-hmm. It's a memoir. Beautiful memoir. And she's doing in prose what we've been talking about, where she's looking at the landscape as healing. So, we read an excerpt from that. We read some from Owen Dalton has a book called The Irish Atlantic Rainforest, where he's talking about this. You mentioned earlier that the colonialism stripping away the trees. So his whole book is about reforesting, rewilding. He has a little excerpt where he's talking about kind of healing the landscape. So we read that, some of the usual suspects, read a little bit of Yeats and a little bit of Heaney. We had a Zoom meeting with Anne-Marie Nichurin, she's brilliant. I think she might be actually coming to Connecticut in the fall, and I'll be sure and let you know. There's a poet in Dingle named Maggie Breen, usually comes to my class, but her poems are also about, kind of a rural upbringing and trying to kind of find identity. So, we would read all these, and then we would actually do some really excellent, sophisticated literary analysis of them. I was actually surprised by how well they were reading these poems. But then we talked about, what they're doing, how do they get that emotion across? I like to start off, or at least at some point in the literary analysis, say, okay, how does this poem make you feel? Let's kind of forget all of the technical stuff. We'll come back to that. But how does it make you feel? And they say, oh, I feel, whatever. And then, okay, what language in particular makes you feel that way? How do they craft an image to make you feel happy? Or how do they craft an image to make you feel sad? Sometimes we would figure it out. Sometimes we go, I don't know. And a lot of it is, real atomic level, how does this word make us feel? And then we would do exercises where we would come up with words that have, I think the phrase we came up with, I had a couple of musicians in the class, words that are minor key words. So words that, for whatever reason, their connotations feel melancholy or sad, or, and then we would try major keywords as well. And then I would turn them loose and let them write. And they would kind of take those, now that we kind of looked at the skeleton behind the poems, how does that structure make us feel? And then they would try and do the same thing with their own poetry. And I thought pretty successfully.
That's awesome. I mean, learning basically at the needs of the masters, right? By looking at those models. Were your students happy to share their work when they were done? Was there a community building going on there in terms of sharing the poetry, or how'd that go?
They just blew my mind with how well we bonded. I've taught a lot of poetry writing classes, and the one thing I keep hearing is that the class is a safe space for them. And I'm not sure what I'm doing, and I wish I knew. I mean, I wish I knew so I could say, here's how to do it. Here's how to make a safe space. But I think a couple of things. I mean, one thing I always do whenever I'm doing a writing workshop, I joke around a lot in class, and I say, okay, our job is to make the poet cry, right? And I'll just, kind of immediately taking that fear that they have and kind of turning it into, it's not really going to happen, kind of joking about it, that sets them at ease in some ways. The other thing I do, I don't give them my poems for us to talk about, but I do post on Blackboard. If you want to look at my stuff, here it is. And as they're writing, I am writing too, and I'm posting my stuff. Again, we're not talking about it, but I'm posting it to show, hey, I'm involved in this too. I'm invested in this too. And I think that is something that helps, because they see, a poet who's actually working and doing the poetry, and it gives them, I don't want to say permission, but I guess it just kind of shows that, this is something that we do, we stumble. And at one point, one of the students said, I want to talk about one of your poems. I'm like, okay. So we talked about it, and they're like, yeah, I don't like this word. And I'm like, okay, what's a good word? And they're like, oh, let's try this word. I'm like, hey, that's a much better word. And that sort of thing, that modeling for them with my own stuff, how the creative process works. There was one big event that stands out. And this is the event I was thinking about before we started. So one of my students had transferred to Sacred Art from another school, and she'd had some, kind of emotional issues, I guess, that were troubling her. And she was asking how to express this, and she said, can I use bad language in a poem, or can I do this? And she was kind of asking for permission to be honest. And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, okay, I didn't really want to do this, but pulled up, I think it might have been the first poem that I had published recently in my latest round. But it's a poem called Sweeney Gelt, which, Mad Sweeney. And it's about my own, experiences with depression and anxiety and mental issues. And I read it to the class, and the woman who'd initially started, to ask the question was, in tears. And I'm like, oh. And then she said, no, this really helps. And, the rest of the class were all kind of teary-eyed. And then I said, okay, well, do you feel like reading your poem now? So she read it, and then broke down sobbing. And then everybody else broke down sobbing. we just had this kind of moment where everybody was being vulnerable. And I think letting yourself be vulnerable when you're writing is hard. I mean, it's insanely difficult. But once somebody does it, then it gives other people permission to do it. So I don't know if that really answers the question. How does it happen? I think a lot of times students just, or not just students, but anybody writing needs permission, right? I think a lot of times we feel like we need permission to say things. And I think in my classroom, what I try to do is give them permission to be honest and to use whatever language works for them.
That's really interesting, Rick. You know, I had a conversation on the podcast a little while ago with Patricia Lee Lewis. She's and she leads workshops all over the world, and she just said so many interesting things about vulnerability that speak to what you're saying. And you know, she compared a person presenting a piece of writing as sharing your new baby. Yes. You put your baby out there, you don't want to hear that the eyeballs are different colors or different misshapen. You want to hear what's beautiful and excellent and lovely and wonderful about that, and to sort of honor the gift and the sharing, and that vulnerability. If I show you my brand new child, this is a new life that I'm protecting. Right. And it does have a life of its own, that piece of writing. Yeah. And when it's shared in a safe way and it's respectfully received, I think then negotiating the language or getting down to that atomic level, as you said, of what's the best word for this. Right. That is really profoundly personal interaction, because you're looking for helping a person or being with somebody as they're finding the best way to express their experience. That's right. That's amazing. And, you know, and that's very different from sort of those nightmare workshops, right, where all the strangers in the circle are going to tell you why it's terrible. Right. Right. Know? Yeah. Lived it, you know.
Yeah. No, I have two, and I hated it. Another thing that I think so much of the way I teach is based on trauma that I had as a student. You know, that professor really ruined my day. So I'm going to try not to be that professor. But one thing I also do is I tell the students, I say, okay, here's what we are. We're going to pretend that we are the editors of a journal called the very prestigious journal. No, that's not it. The most prestigious journal in the world. That's the title of our journal. And we want to accept this poem, but we want to make it perfect for the most prestigious journal in the world. And I think looking at it not as something that you've got to throw away, but as something that you can improve is a big difference. And the way we approach writing in my workshops is, we're not going to say this poem sucks, even if it does. I mean, what we're going to do is, what can we do to make this poem better? And it has kind of, I mean, the end goal is kind of the same, no matter what you say it, but it's a lot easier, I think, to take it if somebody says, okay, here's how I think you can make this good poem into an awesome poem.
And to respect that whatever that poem is comes out of a deeply personal, lived experience of something that matters to that person. Yeah. And to honor the fact that that person is trusting you to honor them back. And nobody got out of bed this morning to hear what somebody else doesn't like about them. It's the same thing. It's your poem. And, you know, and I'm thinking about place and home and the open landscape of Ireland in contrast to our closed and lovely and wonderful Connecticut, right? With our hills surrounding us and tucking us in at night, and the security of that. It's that sort of dialectic, really. You know, you go from the safety to the vulnerability. And, you know, before we started recording, I was mentioning to you that I had done my master's thesis at University College Dublin on Patrick Pearse. Well, didn't he spend his free time when he got it in the west of Ireland in a little cabin in Connemara, you know, and didn't that feed his soul? And wasn't that the beauty and the magic that he and his school teaching buddies fought for in the post office? Right. You know, the right to have that feeling and to express that in the way they saw fit. without permission, which is exactly what you're talking about happening in Dingle with your kids, with your students. That kind of liberating experience of being yourself and in whatever language makes sense, and it's
Right.
And I remember years ago being at a youth hostel in the west of Ireland, and those are interesting places where people with no money know Ireland is an awesome place to be. And you get the Germans and the Italians, and they're all kind of walking around in their Birkenstocks in awe of the landscape. And they get it too. It is that place where you are face to face with your soul.
Yes.
It is amazing. And it's so terrific that you create an inviting, energetic, exciting place for people and young people to experience that and to put it down, to record it through the power of language.
Yeah. And I've been lucky that, there are so many great Irish poets to look at, and also quite a lot in Dingle. We had another poet named Simon O'Fwellyn. Although he is not a native Irish speaker, he learned it in college. He is Irish, but he didn't grow up speaking it. He writes all of his poems in Irish. And we did this walk along, starting in Latif Moor. There's a Saints Way walk there, and we did a part of it about a mile long, going from Latif Moor to the Gallerist Oratory. And we stopped at several ruins of churches along the way, and he read the poems in Irish. And I actually played on that a lot, because the Irish language, even if you don't know it, and I know a few words here and there, just the sound of the language has this, it feels like the landscape. It feels kind of soft and kind of mushy in some ways. And it feels like the fog and the grass and the rain, the soft rain, which we used to call Irish sunshine, that kind of light rain. But the language feels that way. And I spend a lot of time in my own poetry, and I try to do this a lot with my workshops, is what does it sound like? How does sound influence it? And I've always been really obsessed with the way the words sound and the way they feel in my mouth as I'm speaking them.
That really speaks to the relationship between language and place. Those words we choose really do. And it is just so cool that's a very real thing. Sort of some of the idiomatic expressions that are born of place, And
have you read Mencken Magan's books? He's got a book called 32 Words for Field, and then he's got another book that's actually more like a picture book, that's names of animals and places in Irish and in English. It's really a fascinating book about, and I use some of this in my class, because the original place names, as opposed to either a scientific name or a colonial name for a place.
I don't have those books. I'm fascinated by them. I do have one that a friend gave me that she got at the Southbury Public Library Book Fair, that was the Indian names for Connecticut places and what they mean. To get back to the original people of Connecticut, what they call these places that we still use in some version, and to understand what that means, and to see how does that reflect that landscape, that geography. Yeah, it's worth thinking about, and it's a great meditation in and of itself. Rick, would you read one of your poems?
Let's see, what would be a good one? I had a different one picked out, but now we've been doing Ireland so much. This one is about that place I was talking about, Peddler's Lake, and it's a quarry lake, which there's kind of a carved out by glaciers spot in the cliffs, and then the lake is at the bottom, and one of the words for that area is a coombe. So this is called Little Boy Coombe. This is about me and Cormac walking around there. His red cap and blue jacket reflect on the surface of the quarry lake. His eyes move from the cirque ring behind to the rocky face mirrored in the tarn. What happens when you mix green and black? The easy answer is dark green or greenish black. The true answer is you get the wet stone cliff throwing its protective arm around the lake and rain-drunk grass. The sheep inspect us with flat ovine stares and suspicious ear flicks. Why do the sheep say ma, ma, ma? Why is he running away from us? Sheep speak the language of rocks and grass and gorse and ferns. Don't chase them, for they will lead you to fairy rings and she forts. Mud thick and rich as chocolate, wants to eat our boots. Tiny flowers glow like candles on a birthday cake. What happens when you mix black and white and green and purple and blue and yellow? You get a mess that will stain the bathroom sink when we clean your brushes, but you also get the scarf of the sky draped over Connor and Brandon. He passes a small stone shard for me to pocket. It befriends 3 shells from Kumino. Is everything made of atoms? The glacier-cut Silurian sandstone is. The grass, the lichen, the ferns that challenge us to come up with new synonyms for green are. The crow cawing to catch its echoes is. The dainty-footed sheep dancing on tumbled moraine is. The 2 magpies bringing feathery luck are. The soft air caressing your cheek is. The blood we share is. But the joy you feel when you stand on this flat stone, your toes kissing the dark waters, your nose inhaling the scent of peat, is not made of atoms. It is made of sunlight and cloudlight and half-remembered dreams.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, that is really it. That is amazing, and just transported me straight to Ireland. I could see that landscape
so
and that imagery. What happens when you mix green and black? That powerful stuff. Thanks, Rick. That was tremendous.
I think another good thing for poets to do is hang out with kids. Because a lot of people will show you things that you forget to look at.
All right. Well, those are words to live by, and that is advice I am going to take very seriously. I'm going to go find a kid and hang out. Thank you for your time today, Rick, for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Sandy. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.